Ronnie Polaneczky of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And I'm going to let Ronnie introduce the panelists in just a moment. But I wanted to give you a little bit of background about Ronnie because I think you will find that she brings a really interesting perspective to our work. So currently, Ronnie serves as the editor of The Upside, which is a good news and good stories feature of the Philadelphia Inquirer. And she's been with the paper for, I believe she said, close to 2 decades now. And prior to her role, which started with The Upside probably going on 3 years ago, she did a whole bunch of reporting as a columnist who wrote about, in addition to other things, issues facing people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and specifically the services that they rely on. And so she is someone who not only kind of, just is passionate and has a native curiosity about these issues, but it's something that she has developed a deep expertise in over the years. And so we're really grateful that she was willing to join us to moderate today's discussion. So Ronnie is an award-winning journalist who uses her deep listening and reporting skills to bring life to stories about the things that matter most, which she identifies as our communities and our families, as well as fairness and accountability from people in charge. She is a past recipient of the Pulliam Editorial Fellowship, which she used to research Falling Off the Cliff, which was a 4-part series about the lives of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities and the families who care for them. Later on, I'll put a link to that in the chat so that folks can check that out. But she also writes and speaks about the benefits of using positive psychology to shape our stories. And so, Ronnie, thank you so much for being here today and for sharing your perspective and your expertise.
You're welcome. Thank you. And I just want to start. I don't think people thank people like ANCOR and DSPs enough. So from a grateful country, I'm just going to say, and if they don't know that they should be grateful, that's one of the issues. I think that in this country, people with disabilities are still largely invisible. And then the people who care for them are. And to me, it's the most crushing civil rights and human rights issue that we have. And so I think the work that you do, I think you're God's hands and feet in the world. And I thank you for that. So with that, I will introduce our panelists. So first up, we've got Ann Coffey. Hi, Ann, nice to meet you. And for everyone else, Ann is the Executive Director of UCP Oregon, based in Portland. And she began at UCP in 2003 and was named Executive Director in 2013. Her passion is providing services that truly support equity, inclusion, and independence. She's got a background in professional counseling and group dynamics, and she says her working with individuals who experience IDD is an ongoing challenge full of wonder and opportunity. She's excited to embrace the current call to duty while envisioning a more progressive model of practice post-pandemic. So Ann, thanks for joining us. Secondly, we have Charlie Luke. Hi, Charlie. And he is the Executive Director of the Utah Association of Community Services, and that's based in Salt Lake City. In addition to having led this association since 2011, he is a government affairs and public relations consultant with over 20 years of experience managing federal, state, and local political campaigns and creating and implementing media, public relations, and business development campaigns for various clients. So boy, you bring a wealth of pretty broad experience to this, so thank you. And then as Sean said earlier, not joining us is Bernard Baker, and I feel like I still want to tell you about who he is because he had submitted some comments with which Sean can share. So he is president of the board of directors of SAVE, which is the acronym for Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered. As one of the nation's leading self-advocates for the civil rights of people with disability, Bernard has served as president and founding member of People First of Georgia, as well as on the advisory board, for SORTAC, which is the acronym for the Self-Advocacy Resources and Technical Assistance Center. He has been an active advocate ever since fighting for the passage of the ADA in 1990. So that is quite a resume that he brings here too. And I think if he were here, I would have begun with him just because as a person with disabilities who is a consumer of these services, he's the front line. I mean, he's why everybody does what they do. I'm disappointed he's not here. I wish him well. Hope he's feeling better. And I think he did say something. Maybe Sean, if we start with that, I think one of the first questions was, what were the most, like, I guess, what has the impact of the pandemic been mostly on you? Are you able to pull from any of his remarks and just sort of give us a little bit of Sean's, not Sean's, of Bernard's voice?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So Bernard said that prior to the pandemic,
Yeah,
I think one of the biggest challenges that he saw in his role with SABE, right? So he's a self-advocate and somebody who advocates on behalf of other self-advocates.
right.
It's kind of a meta role. He said one of the challenges was getting his members to work together.
Oh, interesting.
And unfortunately, he didn't expand on that. But if anybody has questions about that, like I said, I'm happy to pass those on to him and we can share that. But he said that since the pandemic, it has been really difficult to communicate. He said that people are really scared and that people have had to adapt by learning to use different types of technology that maybe they weren't familiar with.
Sure.
He also said that transportation is a little bit of an issue, and I suspect that that has probably made it harder to communicate for folks who prefer to communicate face to face and get together with others. You know, he said that transportation from place to place is difficult, and you know, we can't meet regularly like we used to do. And he said, you know, it also is a logistical challenge because whereas, you know, one person would drive a van and go around picking people up and dropping them off and taking them to meetings and things like that,
Sure.
you know, they have to adapt by using multiple different vans because you can't have that many people in the car together. And, you know, it just creates another layer of complication. So it sounds like really, you know, before the pandemic, getting people to work together was a challenge, but that has been exacerbated by, you know, these barriers to communication that maybe have been wrought by the pandemic.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that. So Ann, why don't we start with you? Maybe you could just tell us a little bit. What services do you leverage? What do your members deliver? And how have these services been impacted by the pandemic? So it's kind of a three-pronged question. You can jump in however you like.
However I like.
However you like.
Yeah. Full disclosure, I'm out in the country, so if my audio and video start to misalign and it causes some difficulties, just let me know.
Okay, thank you.
So UCP Oregon has been around since 1955. We started one of the first sheltered workshops on the West Coast called the 00 Workshop, which was closed in 1996. And as you mentioned, I came to UCP in 2003. So we do a variety of services. Supported living for adults, which is individualized in-home care, as well as in-home respite care for adults, which is a little bit different. We also do in-home respite and in-home care for kids, birth to 18, in the family home. We provide supported employment services. We also provide case management services, which is unique in Oregon. And we also provide family support services. So we have our hands in just about every area that we could, from birth to death, and individualized service models. So for us, a lot of the changes that many of you may be facing, luckily we had faced over a longer period of time. Oh. We have delivery models that are one individual to one individual. So without going into greater detail and taking up too much time, you can imagine at the initiation of COVID and all of our plan implementation, we kind of came out of the gates a little bit ahead because we didn't have to worry about group contagion control in the same way.
Right, that's interesting,
yeah.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. And we also didn't have to kind of take apart and put back together group transportation, group employment, group day service, things like that. No judgment one way or the other. People know me, know how I feel about all the different service models, but we definitely had more boots on the ground more quickly and more flexibility. The greatest impact, I would say, at this point, service-wise, has been to supported employment. We went from a team of about 20 full-time employees to a team of 5.
Wow.
Yes, we had about 70 individuals that were working in competitive integrated employment, and they were all sent home within the first week or so of the governor's order happening in Oregon to keep us all safe. Obviously, that tanked the revenue source for employment services for our agency, and I won't go into the weeds too much there. So programmatically, that was one of the toughest. Another would be family support. Just by happenstance, Oregon's legislative process and budgeting process resulted in our family networks across the state of Oregon discontinuing, or their funding discontinuing. Some have been able to hold on with other service options and other resources. All of a sudden, we had families across the entire state that had been receiving supports, paid or unpaid, that had kind of the rug pulled out from underneath them. So our family support service that we self-fund at UCP grew astronomically overnight. And of course, not having the capacity to try and help everyone that needed help. Lastly, I'll just say the obvious. This has lasted a whole lot longer than anybody thought, or projected in the beginning. And it's wearing people down in different ways, as we all know, but the mental health piece, the clinical piece, not only for DSPs and for customers, but for all of our employees within the organization, has really been an interesting experiment, not super fun, but we're learning some things. And we're coming together a little more strongly now in this phase, believe it or not. I can't say that we can get through another year like this. I just don't think the toll is worth the compensation that all of us are able to afford our DSPs.
Wow. Yeah. And when you say that went on longer than people thought it would, and it's still going on, so it's, it's so interesting. And reading the report, looking back, like, this is what the year was like. And I'm like, well, maybe we can, instead of saying a year, the new year is like 16 months or 18 months, so there's a lot there. Thank you for that. And Charlie, how about you? What can you tell us a little bit about the services you leverage, what your members deliver, how you've been impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, so we, a vast array of services through HCBS. And so, a lot of our services are done in traditional residential settings. We also have traditional day settings. And our membership varies from, very large providers, that have national connections, to very, really small, 1 or 2 client providers. What we've found in Utah is that during the time that that we've all been dealing with COVID, it's impacted everybody. Large providers, small providers, but the impact is much tougher, I would say, on small providers. At least that's what we're seeing, and day providers in particular. If our members that only do day services are really, really struggling without, the help of retainer payments, without utilizing some of the different flexibilities that Anchor has been advocating for. A lot of those providers, their doors would be permanently closed. So right now, I think what we're looking at is how best to move forward. And in the year now that we've had a chance to kind of look at this, from above as much as we possibly can, since we're right in the middle of it. What I've noticed is that there isn't anything new that we're finding here. And I think, and what I really like about the report this year that Anchor and United Cerebral Palsy have put together, it shows that the cracks that we're seeing in the system have been there. know, it took COVID to, you know, make us realize, or, you know, even if we've seen that there are these issues coming up, you know, we're having to address them now. And so, you know, I think that is the biggest takeaway that all of us can, is as painful as this has been. You know, I think that there are positives that we can take out of it. One of the things that I would hope to see, you know, Anchor and the push that Anchor is doing nationally with our federal delegation and the Biden administration, is to show that you know, while this country was built on local control, human rights are not a local control issue. And that is one of the problems that we're seeing. Yeah,
well
you know,
said.
and we're seeing that a lot. And I think when you look at the map that Donna had in her presentation about which states have utilized, you know, the tools that are available and which states haven't, that is a fundamental unfairness for individuals who, you know, to no choice of their own, have, you know, are living with developmental disabilities. And so this is something I think that as we move forward, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with this in a national way, as opposed to, you know, a 50-state approach, or, you know, with as with COVID and the local health, you know, nearly 600 different directions. So that is something I think we're going to all have to wrap our hands around.
You know, in looking at the report, it laid out so clearly and in a couple different circumstances and ways about how things have had this like cascading effect.
Yep.
So that, you know, like so you have day programs are forced to close, which means that employees get laid off. And then also you can't get the reimbursement for the care. And then some providers may be forced to close for good. And then that leaves their clients scrambling to find new places. And that the cascade it seems like has been happening in every sort of striation of what it is that you do. And so to go back to normal, it's going to be a totally different normal, because you don't have the same landscape. You now have some decimated, you know, day programs and et cetera. So
yeah, I really don't think, and it's not just disabilities, I don't think there is no return to normal. You know, right. I think the new normal, you know, is what we're all still creating at this point. But I don't see us going back. And in some ways, I think that that's a good thing. You know, I think that it's forcing providers to look at things that have been, you know, coming down the pipeline for a while. The settings rule is a good example of that. You know, we knew that this was coming. I think that COVID, you know, has forced providers to start looking at things differently. And I think that can be utilized, you know, in the fulfillment of the settings rule. But what really is important, and I think that what I like about this report is we can't do it without funding. And we can't just do it with existing funding, you know, and I think that's part of the problem that we've seen. Oftentimes when we see, you know, federal rules and requirements coming in, you know, it's essentially just saying, okay, states need to start implementing these changes with the existing budget that you have. Well, the existing budget that we have, most providers honestly were backed into. You know, this is, you know, we've never really had a chance to look at what services are being funded, look at how those services are funded. And I think it really does come down to, you know, whether or not human rights for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities is a national right. You know, if that is something, then I think that as a country, we're going to have to start reevaluating how those services are funded and what mandates are coming forward.
Right. And I think probably the very backbone of all that is the direct support workforce. And I wonder if, Ann, would you like to talk a little bit about that? I'm thinking about what has the impact been on your DSPs, and how has that impacted clients, would you say?
We had expected that we would have several individuals that would stick with no matter what, because that's just who we are and who the DSP workforce has proven to be in Oregon time and time again. Luckily, that has been the case. I think because we were able to be very transparent and open with our workforce, we strategized how to get through the beginning phases of this with the eye on the fear of contagion and the fear of hospitalization and the fear of death, not only for our customers that are all vulnerable in many areas, but also our employees who share, sadly, but do share many of the barriers and obstacles that most of our marginalized populations do.
Right.
So I think it became very clear to our DSPs, they know what their job is, and they know that they're supposed to do everything, and they know that they're not being paid as professionals in a professionalized field. They signed up and they stayed. And we worked with as many people as we could to become as flexible as possible with two parents working at home, kids not being in school, wildfires in Oregon, so on and so on.
I forgot about the wildfires, my God.
Yeah,
Why not, right? Why not? Yeah.
Anything else that could have gone on this year to test all of our limits, but we're resilient. And, you know, I have to say, I've always known we were a resilient workforce. But this has taken it to another level.
Yeah.
We've got, you know, we're more like a family. And I hate to say that in a social working kind of way when we're talking about professionalization.
Sure.
But personally, I've been interfacing with our customers face to face this entire time on a daily basis, and with the healthcare system. And I guess the overall feeling about the DSPs is they're super, super sad in the thought that why, when we've just had two very large episodes in our country, a presidential election, as well as COVID vaccination, where we could have demonstrated equity, or we could have demonstrated some value or some turning in a different direction of what this workforce means to us. Most of the data that we were operating on in Oregon alone isn't accurate when you look at the dependency that the nation has and Oregon has on long-term care supports that happen in the community. Many of us felt forgotten and frustrated. And so I think in a beautiful way, it's brought kind of what many have already said, all of these things that have existed and the cascading effect. But the message is still the same in a lot of ways. We're not demonstrating that we value people with intellectual and developmental disabilities as we should, as equal humans on the planet. And the DSPs that are working for them, unfortunately, have fallen under the same spell. So it's crystal clear at this point. The fear is that we're all talking about it so openly and what we want to do to change things, given this wonderful, crazy opportunity. The fear is everyone's going to be returning to the familiar as quickly as possible. And that we'll lose this opportunity to truly change all of those things that we would agree have existed for many, many, many years in the DD system.
I think one thing that has struck me is that I think probably in so many ways, and maybe Charlie, you can speak to this a little bit, your workforce is so dedicated that I'm not going to say that they make it look easy, but they will make it look oh, they've got it. They've got this. They don't really need more help. I mean, especially you've had, you know, your rates of COVID, especially for people have not been higher than the general population. And they might say all is good there. And I love the report said it's not good enough, you know.
You're absolutely right.
You want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. That is a very real issue. And it's not just for DSPs. And I just want to say that, you know, every success that we've had and the individuals who we're serving, none of that could have been done without our dedicated workforce. And so DSPs are absolutely critical to every service that we do. And so, but you're right, you know, they do their job, and they do it well. And what ends up happening, especially in a crisis situation like COVID, where, you know, all aspects of state government are being impacted.
Sure.
If something looks like it's working, then they will focus on what is on fire. And so, you know, oftentimes it's not just our staff, you know, who make it look easy, but our provider system does that as well. You know, our provider system will work with, you know, whatever, you know, mandates or, you know, requirements are out there, and we just figure out how to do it. But we've been doing that now for 3 decades. And this is where I think it's time that we need to have a deep dive, because as we're talking about reinventing the system, as we're talking about being more person-centered, all of that can be done. But this is a time that we can actually do it, because the only time that you're going to really, you know, shake things up is when you're forced to do so. We're all forced to do so right now. But, you know, as dedicated as our staff, you know, our staff is, we have a 75% turnover rate in Utah before COVID. So right now, you know, what we've found is that, you know, that our turnover has ticked up a little bit, but we're seeing more and more open positions where we can't take on more clients because we don't have the staff to serve them. And so there, you know, that is another, you know, issue or area that I think, you know, is now being exposed by COVID, that I think we really need to start looking at. But staffing, you know, this is a people-driven, that's what we do. We can't do it without people. And those individuals have to be paid. They have to be compensated fairly. And so one of the things that I really like seeing in the report is Anchor's, you know, reintroduction of the HCBS Infrastructure Act. That is something I think that can be done, you know, which will help to start funding some of these things. But I think we need to go further than that. I think CMS really does need to start looking at tying wages and rates, you know, to compensation or to the waivers, because right now leaving it up to the states isn't working. You know, again, some states do it, some states don't. But the other you know thing that is coming down, you know, we're dealing with COVID, but within 3 years, most likely, we're going to also be dealing with trying to increase everybody to a $15 an hour minimum, you know, federal minimum wage, which, you know, if we could be paying people $15 an hour right now, we would. You know, our reimbursement rates are, you know, in Utah, we're now up to about $11.50 an hour. So, you know, though that is another area that, you know, we're going to have to really start addressing, and now is the time to do it.
As someone who has held office, so I'm just imagining you might have an idea about this. Why has there been such a holdup as far as getting like a standard occupational code for DSPs?
It's a good question.
Is it just that we just devalue care in general in this country? Like we don't, I mean, what do you think that would be?
I don't even think it's that. I think a lot of times elected officials are, you know, there's a triage attitude. You know, you take care of what is right in front of you. And again, you know, DSPs and providers have done, you know, a fantastic job, you know, making sure that, you know, people are being served and the quality of care that they're receiving is the highest that it can be. And they do it to their own detriment, you know, honestly, because, you know, and so I think now that we have these things that we have to deal with, we know that we have to deal with COVID. We know that we have to deal, you know, we're having to figure that out. Now we know that we're going to have to figure out federal minimum wage. You know, we can complain about that. We can, you know, harp on it. The reality is that's a good thing. So let's figure out how to make it work. But what really worries me is that when we think big, thinking big doesn't work with local control. Because again, it goes back to, you know, how, you know, who's going to do what, and some places are going to do it and some will choose not to.
Right. Wow. if I could ask Ann a little bit about this. I was surprised reading the report that something as that I would just presume is a no-brainer, which is that you could have, computerized signatures, that had not been a thing, and that if there are family caregivers who could give some care, that wasn't a thing. Like these seemed like I read it and I'm like, how is that not a thing? How could that not be a thing? And it does make me think a little bit too that how this field, you know what you need, and it took this pandemic. And I mean, and I'm sure that these are things that you've been all sort of screaming about for a long time. And then the pandemic, ushered in, oh, okay, this can work. Were there any other things that ended up being just really, really helpful that you had wanted for a while and now you have them?
I think the ability to spend time with a customer delivering a service virtually and being able to get paid for that. So we talked a bit about telehealth before, but we've created, because we had to, due to a lack of bandwidth, a great deal of efficiencies that really did rely and continue to rely on technology, making sure we have the technology in the hands of our customers and our employees. Everybody knows how to use it, and so on. So there was that piece of shifting to that happened pretty quickly. And then we had the technology, but we didn't have the regulatory flexibility to kind of use it to its fullest extent. In Oregon, I'd say the hottest button issue, and it's going to continue to play out in further discussions, is the payment of family caregivers. It has been historical in Oregon that some people agree that paying family caregivers to provide care to their minor age children or their adult age children is a no-no. And there's a lot of research that supports why there's concerns there. And there's others that believe that it's essential when you look at the cliff that we're facing with baby boomers needing care, with COVID right now, and then the continued trajectory of more people needing care in home. The writing's on the wall, yet we have this really strong culture of protection and representation in Oregon that we want to be as non-biased as possible so that people can truly live self-determined lives. Unfortunately, families are families. And all of our families are very unique and interesting to work with. But at the end of the day, leveraging families and supporting families in the best ways possible to support the provider organizations and the DSPs that are working with the families and the kiddos and the adults is the way to go. We just have to rethink how we want to do that. Right now, obviously, we can. A lot of just administrative chasing, a lot of things that we would be required to do face-to-face just because it's always been that way, have been removed. And it's, I think, allowed for some closer communication in some ways and some more authenticity to develop amongst individual service planning teams. We've gotten away from kind of all of the ancillary, non-necessary kind of hours and contract-driven services. I don't want to throw out that we're not doing what we're supposed to be doing, but we do have flexibility in some of our service areas to negotiate almost on a daily or weekly basis what types of services are delivered in what types of settings. So having that flexibility has allowed us to man up where we need to man up on any given day. Those are some pieces. Obviously, everything's been stated as far as, what the feds have done to help us financially or regulatory wise. I'm just, again, kind of looking at this, wondering what's next. And, the great tell or the great lie or the great whatever, we need to start saying no. And unfortunately, until we do in some way, there really isn't an incentive, I don't think, for most of the rest of the nation to be concerned about a very small, when you talk about intellectual and developmental disabilities, group of people, and relationally a very small amount of money somewhat when you look at other services that are offered. So we need to stand up in a positive way, but we need to stand up in an organized way. I agree, nationwide, and make some movements here.
It sounds like part of what has been interesting in how people have responded and how, I mean, I'm thinking if you can do telehealth, you can do some virtual classes and treatments and things. And it seems like what that's getting away from in a good way is this idea that one size fits all and one size should fit all. And in the mainstream community, there's some people take online classes because that just works for them. Other people want to be in person, it just works for them. And why would people with disabilities be any different? So I'm wondering, and maybe Charlie, you could speak to this a little bit, about this idea of one size fits all doesn't work. And we've seen some evidence of how that might play out if we can get our arms around that idea.
Let me unmute myself. Absolutely. You know, I think that, you know, and that's part of the difficulty, because, you know, we say that, you know, one size doesn't fit all, but then at the same time I say, you know, we need to have a national strategy and not leave it up to states. There is a very fine line. I think a lot of the flexibility, when we talk about flexibility, it is fine to leave flexibility up to the locals, you know, to the states, to figure out what best works. When it comes to funding and when it comes to compensation, that is something that I think we probably need to have, you know, a stronger federal dictate on how that's going to work. We don't need CMS telling, you know, or the federal government saying this is how you need to run your service in Oregon or Utah or Virginia or wherever you are. You know, we still need to have that creativity and the flexibility to deliver those services. But we need to have, you know, everyone needs to be operating off of the same playing field. And and so, you know, I saw there were some questions in or some comments in the chat about the minimum wage, and how this service has never been a minimum wage service. Even in Utah, for example, you know, where we've you know had to work, you know, 7 years now to get us up to $11.50 an hour. The federal minimum wage is still $7.25. So, you know, we're still, you know, there's still a big chunk above that. What worries me is that if we only talk about, well, we need to get our staff up to $15 an hour, we're going backwards. Even though we're paying more, we're going backwards because we're now creating minimum wage jobs, which DSPs have never, it's never been a minimum wage job.
Oh, that's a great point. Yeah.
So one of the things I know that Anchor has talked about is, you know, looking to figure out some sort of you know, a reimbursement at 150% of whatever the federal minimum wage is, and have that kind of be something that starts to adjust every year, so that in 10 years or 15 years, we're not back in a situation now where we have to essentially double a minimum wage and try to do it in 3 years. So I think if there is some way, you know, and that is, again, something that CMS, that the federal government can help with to figure out, so that there is some sort of a link to compensation or to reimbursement of those services. There is also a possibility that if we do that, that you will have some states that will opt not to participate. You know, I think that I look at Utah, for example. You know, it would not surprise me to see, you know, Utah saying, well, you know what, we don't want the federal government telling us what to do, so we're going to pull out. That is a very real risk. But what we have been doing, we can't continue to go down the same path. We need to look at something different. And so I appreciate Anchor's creativity and the work that they're looking at there, so that this isn't just the DSPs are not a minimum wage job.
Right. Okay. We have about 2 minutes before we toss it back to Sean, but I feel like I want to leave on sort of a hopeful note, and just wondered if maybe give you guys a chance to just brag on your people. Like, what's a great story that sort of sticks in your mind from the last year? Ann,
I'm stealing this. I got to steal this.
Okay.
So, well, first of all, we've been, yeah, we have no time, so I get that. We've been in the medical professional arena now a lot because of COVID. We're taking people in and getting vaccinations, we're taking people in and getting tests, whatever. So we've been interfacing with various healthcare professionals more than, not more, I would say, but with less distraction around, meaning other people. And I think what we have gained is a lot more knowledge and interest in what it is that we're doing. Because when we have individuals hospitalized or when we have individuals going in for treatments and whatnot, we stay and we provide oftentimes at least nursing level, if not more, types of personal care and other health related supports and treatments. And the hospital staff actually ask and allow us to do that. Now, this isn't the case everywhere, but I believe that there's a knowledge that we are here and that the world needs us to do what we've been doing so well for so long, but not an idea of how technical it was and how professional it truly is.
Yeah.
So anyway, that's been cool. To see doctors and specialists and all sorts of people kind of stepping aside and paying honor to our direct support staff to say, hey, will you come here and reposition this person? Will you come here and do the suctioning? Will you come here and change the G-tube? All of those things that we do it so uniquely and so individualized that they're really providing us with a lot of compliment. And I think we need to leverage that as far as any advocacy goes for professionalization of the field.
That is such a great idea because you're now sort of bumped above the radar. So now they have a real sense of what it is you do. Awesome. I hope you do that. Charlie, you want to close us out? I want to brag on your people a little?
Very quick story. And all of our providers have done, similar things, but the story that really has stuck with me happened very early on in the pandemic. I think it was in April when, the first shutdowns were right in the middle of it. People were still trying to figure things out. And we had a day program up in Logan, Utah, which is in the northern part of the state, a small college town up there. And their staff had not been able to work. The program had been closed down. Their staff organized a parade to go to the residential, to the homes of these folks.
No way.
And all of the staff would had signs. They played the client's favorite song that they would use during the day program. Yeah. And it was all socially distanced. What we tried to, there were a couple of clients that did run outside and hug their staff. We tried not to do that, but yeah. But it's that kind of creativity and that kind of work that everybody is doing to try to figure out how to make something that is so confusing to everybody to bring some normalcy to it. And so, that I wanted to close on that because again, it was from the start of the pandemic, but still that is what all of us are doing. That is what, all of our staff are doing. We, DSPs do this because they believe in it. Yeah. Providers are in this, in this field because of the services that they're doing. Right. And so it as hard as things are, it is still a great field to be a part of and to work with incredible folks. And so, that's where I think that keeps me going, wow. when it gets really tough.
Wow. Well, you put a lump in my throat, and what a beautiful story. It's a beautiful story. So thank you so much, Ann and Charlie, and to Bernard. I hope he does well. And Sean, I'm going to bounce this back to you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if you guys don't mind staying on camera, and then I'll also invite Donna to come back on camera because I think we have at least one question for her as well. But just as a reminder to everyone, if you can put your questions in the Q&A, we will get to as many as we can. And if we run out of time, we can certainly follow up with those after the fact. But my first question It's actually kind of a multi-part question, and I think it is for Ann. Somebody from the Kresser Institute asks, Ann, is your agency able to support people with IDD who have high support needs using supported living? Does that support 24-hour awake one-to-one staff? And more specifically, does supported living pay for room and board and other basic needs for people who are being supported in that context? And do people have roommates? So maybe just say a little bit more detail about all of that.
We provide supported living services to people 24/7 who need it, and people that have been gauged as being highest need in our service delivery system. We have awake employees and people who are able to sleep uninterrupted as well. Keep prompting me. I had the question up here and then it disappeared.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Didn't realize that I was affecting your view. I mean, the other part of it is, do people have roommates? And
we don't use a roommate model. Yeah, we used to use a roommate model, and we were at the time that we were utilizing the roommate model, essentially using sub-minimum wage to pay our own workforce to take care of the customers that we were supporting. Some things changed with federal law and some companionship exemption pieces, and we decided at that time as an organization based on value to not use any kind of sub-minimum wage or stipend or roommate or caregiver. We pay everybody hourly, whether they're working in whichever household. So I think that is helpful for a lot of reasons. Housing is obviously a huge problem nationwide. Portland Metro is having a great time with that right now. We have been able to, because we have 24-hour staff or other staff that are in people's homes for significant periods of time, the agency will pick up pieces of utility, pieces of rent, things like that to help offset the cost. I want our customers to live wherever they want to live, which means not just Section 8 or subsidized housing. So we've been pretty creative about trying to figure out ways to get people into whatever community they want to be actively living in. It's expensive, and there's legal and regulatory ways to go about leveraging funds from other areas to offset the cost of that, and that's what we do.
Great, thank you so much. The next question I suspect is probably best answered by Donna or Charlie, but Jacqueline Kaufman wants to know, what legislative mechanism do you feel is the best access point for us to press and advocate for federal dollars to feed towards states to offset catch-up services for children with disabilities who have not had access to special education services over the past year? So either of you want to take that question, or both of you?
You want to jump in, Donna, and I'll tag team it?
Sure. Okay. Well, I think the first thing to remember is IDEA is an incredibly powerful federal mandate. And I think as much as you can remind your state and local Department of Education folks that you're aware of that they are obligated to provide the appropriate educational services to kids with special needs, that lets them know that, you know, they're on watch for this. Also, I think certainly advocating with your federal delegates, your Congress people, and your senators about this issue. If you're seeing that as being a particularly problematic in your state, I would certainly reach out to your federal delegates, reminding them the same thing, that you know, you're supporting children with special education needs, and they've probably been at the biggest disadvantage during this pandemic.
Great.
Yeah, I agree. I think, you know, everybody, if you have not been working with your federal delegation, now's the time to start. You know, work with their staff, reach out. But I do think that it is very important, even if you come from a state like Utah, where yeah, it's still important to work with your federal delegation.
Great, thank you both for that. I'm going to ask one more question because I then want to make sure that we have enough time for closing remarks from Anchor CEO Barbara Merrill. But I wanted to actually take liberty and go off script a little bit and ask Ronnie a question. Ronnie, from your perspective as a journalist, what are the things that we can be doing to garner more attention, specifically in the press, for the unique ways in which these issues are impacting our services and the people who deliver them? You know, we've talked about wages that DSPs experience. We've talked about the pending, increases in minimum wage and how that's going to affect providers. We've talked about all of these regulatory flexibilities. From whatever vantage point, I'm curious to hear from your perspective, how do we make the case that more attention deserves to be paid by the press to these types of issues?
That is such a great question. I wish I had the most hopeful, wonderful answer for you. In order for me to write about it with the Philadelphia Inquirer, I obtained a fellowship so that I could just focus only on the topic of falling off the cliff and what happens when, families run out of the educational monies that their kids are entitled to. I did the series, got a whole lot of reaction, and then, and have done follow-up stuff over the years, but I think there is still a perception problem unless someone has an actual, and it pains my heart to say this, unless someone has an actual experience in their family, or they have a great neighbor or someone where they really know somebody with a disability, it's still so invisible. I don't know what it's going to take. And I was thinking about this just earlier this week, thinking why, finally now Black Lives Matter now is really front and center. People have been screaming about that for years and years and years. I feel like what has moved the needle is that it happened during a pandemic when everyone's attention could just be focused on that horrible story, and that it kept unfolding. And so maybe, as you've been saying, this pandemic really has given you a chance. I would think that maybe even before getting the media's attention, if you can partner with other very sort of well-known, respected organizations like the American Medical Association, the American Nurses Association, the people who have now seen you front lines doing this stuff, is there some way you can piggyback onto them? There are probably far more members of the American Nursing Association and the AMA than there are people maybe with disabilities in the country. But they go into their professions for the same reasons that you do. They want to help. They want to help. And they help more people who don't have disabilities. So I don't know, maybe a question would be just to figure out how to leverage that relationship, piggyback with them and say, we matter too. We matter too. We have to matter as much as your mainstream patients do, and what we do really matters. I also think we have a real problem in this country with, we marginalize care. Basic care, we marginalize it. It's seen as women's work, it's seen as babysitting, and it isn't until one of your family members is up against it, and then you get someone who comes in and treats your dear mother like she's a baby, and you're like, whoa, this is not what I signed up for. So we're in a tough spot. We're in a tough spot. I'll keep you posted.
Yeah, no,
if you come up with anything, let me know.
No, I love that perspective though. And I think you're exactly right. And obviously you don't have all the answers, but I think those are helpful starting points for us.